All right, so welcome everyone. Thanks for taking a little bit of time out of your day to go through this. This is some good stuff. I've been kind of actually developed this presentation a little bit more in the last couple of weeks, working with the folks over at Sage. So kind of want to do a couple things. The objective here is talk mostly about the process, what's going to go through, what the whole process for migrating your data, getting ready for Sage Intacct. And that doesn't really matter whether you're 300 or 100 as far as the product you're using. The process is going to be the same. There's some mechanics that are going to be a little bit different. Some of the mechanics I talk about or show here, kind of, it looks like it's more 300, but it really is the same process for 100 or 300. So just wanted to kind of go through that a little bit. So excuse me. So upfront decisions, I think this is the kind of the planning stage for doing a migration, whether it's Sage Intacct or any software, quite frankly, over my career. But you got to figure out what the value of the historical data. What do you want to bring over? What's the usefulness of it? How far back do we go as far as number of years? And is it going to, how much detailed transactions versus just balance forwards, or a little bit of both? So we go through that conversation. So those are things to think about when we start looking at a migration. My big thing is this is your migration. So this is going to be how it works for your organization, not so these aren't necessarily just templated things. That's how you what you need for your organization. And there's kind of I break it down to 4 simple steps or milestones, if you will. You design what we're going to migrate. We extract the data. We transform the data to the new formats in some sort of step, and then we populate. Now that's real simple because there's a lot more to it than that, but generally that's kind of the simple process. And in the Sage 300 world, we're on the extract. There's also steps in here. So you want to clean up your data, get rid of old data, archive, etc., what have you. And then what we do is we put it into a staging database. Basically makes it, at this point in time, we're putting it into a Microsoft SQL database, where we run some additional validations on it, and then quality check, make sure things are still looking good, transform it into a Sage Intacct database, and then formatted, I should say, and then it gets created into Sage Intacct. So I'm going to kind of touch on that just a little bit more detail here in a few minutes, because there's like 8 steps that we've got lined out for that. But some of the challenges to think about, and this is where I've seen this over the years, and we all get to deal with it, because most of us, if you've been using Sage Timberline for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, you have a lot of data. So things that we got to think about, it's a moving target. When we're going to do the migration, because we're going to do some pilot migrations. So when are you going to do it? Identify a good cutover date that works with your production or your work schedule or your business cycles, if you will. My dirty data, and that's not dirty dancing, by the way. So we've got to clean up. So we've got a lot of data out here over years, cleaned it up. We've got to map it. We've got to do some transitions. And then again, what to convert? What are we going to migrate or convert? And then how do we know it's right? We got to reconcile, balance it, and all that kind of good stuff. So what we do is what we're proposing, again, doesn't matter if you're 100 or 300, is kind of break the migration into 2 steps. Step 1 being, what do you need to go live? What do you need to keep doing business? And basically take that first. And that's the first step. So whether receivables, job cost, general ledger, employees, payables, contracts, subcontracts, what have you, whatever you need that we need to do to keep doing business as you do now. And then afterwards, and this can be at some point in time, but doesn't need to be immediate. Now let's go get the historical data that you need for additional analysis, if you will. So this is where we break it up so that it's manageable, so we get what you need to do, continue running business, doing what you always do with minimal impact, get you up and running on Intacct, and then we'll go back and say, okay, now let's bring in some historical data. And then, I'm going to touch a little bit more on that as well, because there's a couple of options we have in that space to think about. So this is Chutes and Ladders game, by the way. So I looked at this is what it made me think of. So this is kind of the more steps that we do. Again, I've got 300 up at the top, but it's really the process similar for Sage 100. Create a plan, cleanup, data cleanup, preferably in Sage 300 or Sage 100, clean up the data there, do extraction, and then we're going to do quality review after that extraction and look for other issues. And that might send us back to more data cleanup. It might not. At that point in time, we go to the next step. We provision a blank Intacct instance for you with no data, and we do a pilot migration. So we bring the data over and do some validations there. We can do training using that, because that way we're doing education using your data. And sometimes, God forbid, we find more errors and we have to go back to data cleanup again. So that's kind of the whole process. And we will go through that whole thing. So again, just kind of reiterating the steps here. You know, project initiation, hey, plan it out. How many data folders do we have? What's our target date? What's our target go live date? So you see the pilot and the target go live. Data preparation or data cleanup, as I put it. If you've been using it for a long time, what do you archive? What do you closing old jobs? Just a general cleanup. This is also the time we want to go through and do some of those, what I call deep reconciliations, particularly in the Sage 300 world, where we've experienced these in the past. If you've been on it a while, you go through and add up all the job cost transactions for a job, and suddenly it doesn't necessarily match the totals on the category record, or the totals on the cost code record, or the accumulator buckets on the job record. So figuring out where that's out of sync and getting that cleaned up beforehand, that's one of the big things. Same thing with general ledger. Run through the process of reconciling your general ledger transactions equal the accumulator buckets on the account record. It's real important for Intacct, because Intacct is basically designed a lot different, and transactions mean everything in Intacct. So you're going to see where the transactions drive everything in Intacct. So that's really an important step, and there's some tools that already exist in Sage 300 to do that. So just a thing to think about. So then we get to the data analysis, extraction analysis. So this is where we actually take the 300 or 100 data, get it into a SQL, a different SQL database. I know 100 is already SQL, and we look for any other discrepancies. We get it loaded in there, and we're looking at the data. This is where data quality review. So this is where we look at, do we have orphaned records? Do we have out of balance keys? Do we have missing keys, out of balance situations in GL? So hopefully we're trying to catch that in step 2. But this is another place where the tool has been built to look for certain things. We have inactive customers or vendors. This is going to spit out some reports for us that says, here's a vendor you haven't written a check to in 10 years. Do you want to convert them? So it does kind of get us a chance to maybe go take a step back and do some additional cleanup based on what we need. Key changes are mentioned down here too. Again, we'd do that earlier if we're going to change our job structure. We're going to change our cost coding structure. if we're going to make those look differently. And there's some reasons to think about that, because the way Intacct handles subjobs or extras is a little bit different. It certainly can handle it, but what's nice about it is it can actually handle several levels of that. So a lot of flexibility in Intacct that 100 doesn't even have that capability, but 300 has it as well. So things to think about on that. So we're going to go through this process here, this data review, and that might send us back to doing some more cleanup. If not, then we're going to go out and we're going to provision Intacct. So we'll set up Intacct, and this is with the help of your consultant. So once you set up a blank Intacct instance, then we'll go and set up all the entities, the locations, departments, the cost codes, cost types, all that kind of, the transaction definitions, all the kind of stuff you need in Intacct to go get rolling. Then we're going to do a pilot migration. We're going to take your cleaned up 300 or 100 data and drop it in to Intacct, and then go through validations, reconciliations. We'll do some training. User acceptance testing is critical in here to make sure everything has been migrated and converted over cleanly. And this is where you kind of saw the chute in my chutes and ladder analogy. We may go back and have to do some cleanup in the data, and then come back and do a second pilot migration to make sure everything is where it needs to be, because we just don't want to bring bad data over. Then once we got all that done and we're happy, customers are happy, you guys are happy, we've all signed off on everything, we've gone through a pretty extensive user acceptance testing, now we're ready to go through and do our live migration. So we'll go back and re-extract the data from 300, go through the same processes. At this point in time, we've got it pretty clean. So again, the pilot migration, and then a week to however long it is, we'll go to the live migration. Pardon me. We'll re-extract the data and go through those previous steps, but hopefully we'll hit them pretty cleanly, and then bring them into the Intacct. Go sit down, do live validations. We'll sit with you during those first go live processes, getting comfortable with it, all that kind of stuff, and the live validation. And then at some point in time, who knows when that might be, we go back and maybe bring over historical jobs if we want to have that kind of data for reporting, other analysis. Maybe we want some vendor history or customer history, things like that. So that's stuff that's not critical for go live, for doing day-to-day processing, but it's something you may want to have within Intacct going forward to be able to just analyze and manage the business. So along those same lines, though, keep in mind your legacy software doesn't just vanish. Sage 300, Timberline, Sage 100 doesn't just magically vanish. You have the option of keeping it on a server in your location as is. You have the option of moving that to a private cloud hosting provider. And Sage is more than willing to allow licenses to continue for 100 and 300 after you go live with Intacct for this purpose, and not charge anything. They're not going to sit there and charge you maintenance and support on 300 or 100 because you're using it for legacy reporting. However, and this is in bold for a reason, my favorite is archive that entire Sage database, or Sage, and Sage 100 is already in Microsoft SQL. In the Microsoft SQL Replicator or Antera, two big tools for that, and archiving and saving that, and you can use whatever reporting tool you want to pull that in. and you have access to historical information. A step beyond that is the last bullet point there is you can use other BI tools such as Power BI, Microsoft Power BI, any other BI tool that's out there. I'm drawing blank on names right now. And you can pull data from these legacy SQL databases as well as Intacct and have both sets of data sitting in the dashboard. Terra can do that for you. So to me, that's probably what I would prefer if I was doing this for my company, because then I don't have to worry about maintaining 100 or 300 or worrying about it being outdated on a particular server platform or things like that. And I can have access to my historical data through whatever reporting tool I want. Other considerations are if you're using some ISV products such as TimberScan, Paperless, Sage Service Operations, or Sage Field Operations, those products are being developed. Some of them are already available in Intacct. So most of the ISVs that you might be using are going to be available in Intacct. Integration with Procore, for example, already exists. Integration with Autodesk's cloud, things like that are in progress. And then some of the other ISVs that you might be using, that the Office connector, extracting data to Excel, and my assistant for alerting. A lot of those functions are native in Intacct anyway, so you may not need those, but there are some tools available for that as well. So I'll pause there for a question or two if we want there, Lauren, if we've got any.
I have not seen any come in yet, Steve.
Awesome. All right, so here's what everybody wants to know. How much is this going to cost? And I have a partial answer. So what we're doing is, if we go back to that roadmap I had down, we get to the data extraction analysis stage where we've actually pulled your Sage 300 data, put it into a SQL database, ready to transform it into an Intacct database. And we have some of those validation and data quality reports available to us. Once that is done, up to that stage, that's what we need. That's data we need to know in order to take the next step of actually finishing the process. Because a lot of this is, the big variable is how many transactions are we converting, how many years back, all that kind of stuff. And how many data folders and entities, things like that. So what Sage is doing is, for that first step, they have a price of $38.50 plus $100 per data folder. That'll get you to the point where we can see how clean the data is, what other validation errors we might have to go back and clean up. But at that point in time, they'll be able to turn around and then give you a scope of work for completing the rest of it, completing it all the way into Intacct based on the transaction volumes, how much historical data, and some things like that. And that's going to be an unknown number at this point in time, but it's going to be a quote less how much was charged in part one. So you're basically going to get credit for what you've already paid to finish the process. And as you guys know, most of them, the migrations and data conversions, I used to always put a little graphic up as you can have as much as you want. It's just how big the dollar signs are going to be or how many dollar signs are behind it. So that's always a consideration. So to give you an exact number, it's going to be a case-by-case basis. But at least we'll know what it costs to at least get you to the point where we can get you a number. It's going to be around $4 grand or so. Okay. So hopefully that helps a little bit with just thinking and planning what the migration looks like. I think last time I did this